We are here today with Frank Viola, a best-selling author, speaker, podcaster, blogger. Frankie V, I see you go by as well. Thanks for being here with us. Welcome to the Men's Alliance podcast, brother.
Hey man, I am honored to be on. This is the first time I've ever been interviewed by a
Yeah,
Goose. So this will be a treat. I appreciate it.
man. So I first found out about you by a friend sending me the book Pagan Christianity.
Mm, mm,
And I dove into that, and it is a boy, that book just grabs you like by the throat right off the
mm,
bat. And that's when I started realizing and discovering the scope of your work, and the more men that I've talked to who are familiar with you and read your works, um, I've come to learn that Pagan Christianity is like a gateway book for a lot of us. That
right.
seems to be one that kind of like a lot of men hear you through. Um, but we want to talk a lot today about your latest book. I'm holding it up here for our camera. If you're driving, don't try to look at your phone right now. But for those of you watching us on YouTube, Frank's new book, The Untold Story of the New Testament Church. Frank, tell us a little bit about this book and what led you to write it.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just back up a few steps here and give your listeners sort of an overview. Because you mentioned Pagan Christianity, which came out in 2008, and
Yeah.
I co-authored that with George Barna. And what we were doing in that book was trying to give Christians who left the institutional church but who still love Jesus and still want to have Christian community and fellowship. We wanted to give them green light permission that leaving the institutional church and meeting the way the early Christians did in simplicity and community with face-to-face fellowship without a lot of the institutional trappings and practices. We wanted to give them permission that they were on biblical grounds and historical grounds. So that's really what the book was for.
Hmm.
We didn't write it for pastors or to pastors. We didn't write it to people who like to go to Sunday morning church services. Rewrote it for radical people who said, you know what, there's got to be more than this, meaning, Sunday morning church service. And when they
Hmm.
read the New Testament, they see something very, very different. And so we wanted to kind of give them an idea of where all of these institutional practices came from, how the church kind of morphed into a business, which it in many cases operates that way. And so that's who the book was written for. And it was just as you said, gateway. It was we call it the gateway drug
Hmm.
for radical thinkers, people who really want to go back to the New Testament in terms of practice, in terms of belief, doctrine, etc. So that opened the door, and there were follow-up books, the constructive sequels that came out, and then my work moved on to all Christians, whether they're in traditional, institutional, denominational churches or not, but who are hungry for more. People who say in their hearts, there has to be more than this, more to the Christian faith, more to Jesus Christ, more to knowing the Lord, more to the Bible, etc., etc. And so what I have done is I put together a library of 20 books, all on the deeper Christian life, things that many Christian people and authors don't talk about today. And if your listeners are interested in any of it, they can go to Frank Viola, one word, frankviola.org. Okay. That brings us to the new book, which just released in March 2025. In that book, as you showed it to everybody, people who are just listening to this, it's the one with the white cover and the brushstrokes on the sides. It is a revised and expanded edition of a very, very old work that I did in my youth that just was
Hmm.
not very good. That's why it says it revised and expanded. And this is really is a brand new book in every respect. And in answer to your question, I'll give your listeners an elevator pitch on what it does.
Yeah.
In many ways, Goose, it is the other side of pagan Christianity. Because what pagan Christianity does is it kind of takes a blowtorch to
Yeah.
many of our church traditions. And I'm not talking about Catholic traditions, I'm talking about in the evangelical Protestant world.
Yeah.
Things that are not in the Bible, where'd they come from? Where did we get all this stuff from, right? If it's not in the New Testament, where did it come from? So that's what that does. It sort of is the deconstructive piece. But then this new book, The Untold Story of the New Testament Church, Revised and Expanded, shows you exactly what happened in the New Testament in the first century, how the churches met, how Christian leaders were raised up, how they were trained, how the believers navigated problems and what the churches look like and so forth. And I'm really trying to give people a key that unlocks the New Testament because you see, we read the New Testament, but we kind of read it in a vacuum and we read our century back into it. The
Mhm.
New Testament was written, 2,000 years ago in a different world. And so, what my book does is it unlocks the New Testament by seamlessly weaving the narrative of Acts with the epistles. And it provides a free flowing story from Matthew to Revelation in chronological order, but also filling in all the details. And so, what many people have said to me, Goose, because it just came out a few months ago, is that it reads like a movie on paper. It's
Mm.
sort of a cinematic experience. You're transported back to the first century and you see everything that happens. And I bring it to life by all of the research that I've done on the first century, what the cities look like, the population of the cities, what the people were like, how they lived. And so when you're reading the New Testament, now with this background, because it does it for every single letter that Paul wrote, James wrote, Peter wrote, you're actually understanding who they're writing to, why they're writing these letters, because you've seen the movie. And that's what the book is. It's like a movie on paper. And so the motivation behind it, in answer to your question, is I wrote this book because this narrative approach, this chronological, historical narrative approach to reading the New Testament radically changed my life. And so I wanted to pass it on to others so that they would have the same experience. Over 20 high voltage New Testament scholars endorsed the book. The greatest of them all, Craig Keener, wrote the foreword, and many of them have told me there is no other book like this that puts the whole thing in chronological order, but fills in all the details and turns it into a narrative that you can read and understand that's highly documented and cited. And so that's why I put my hand to the plow and put this book out.
Wow. That is a lot, right? So this is a lifetime work type of a robust, really mountain of research, historical context. When you read through it, there's sections where you feel like you were just reading the Bible, right? It's like
Mhm.
it's passages, it's chapters, it's books, it's letters. You're reading the Bible, but then there's more than that. Then it stops and it breaks it down. So I like the description there about kind of like reading through a movie.
Mhm.
It's unique. When you sent me a copy, I'd never seen anything like this. The some pages, the footnotes are
Right.
3/4 of the page, right? So I mean, just it's scholarly and researched, but also just readable and not intended to be an
That's right.
academic work. Would that be correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. I wrote it so a high school student could understand it. And we are getting responses from high school students. We're also getting responses from older men and older women who only read fiction. They don't read
Mm.
nonfiction books. And they're telling me it's so easy to read and it's a joy to read. And so basically, I would say this to your listening audience. I used to have a CD player Remember those? I don't know
Yeah.
if you
Yeah.
had one in my car, right? It was a CD
Oh,
player in my
yeah.
car, right? So I put a CD in. I was driving one day in a long trip, and I'm listening to this audiobook on CD. And all of a sudden, as I'm hearing it, it's not making sense. It's moving from one scene, one chapter to another, and it dawned on me why it wasn't making sense. I had the shuffle feature set to on. Okay. So I'm hearing chapter 1, then it goes to chapter 10, then to chapter 5, then to chapter 7. Well, I had a revelation, and that revelation was our New Testament, the way we have it today,
Mm,
is set on shuffle. All of the letters in the New Testament are not arranged in chronological order.
mm,
Okay. When Paul wrote Romans, that was not his first letter. That comes right after Acts, right? And it's
right.
interesting too, because in the book of Acts, Luke ends that narrative where Paul is in Rome on house arrest. And then the next book you read in the New Testament, next book you come to is Romans. So it's natural to think, okay, Paul's in Rome. That's where Luke leaves him in the last chapter
Yeah.
of Acts. So he wrote Romans. No, he hadn't even been to Rome when he wrote the book of Romans. Okay.
Yeah.
So the letters are not arranged chronologically, they're arranged by length. And then we had another problem, and that is verses were added to the New Testament in the 1500s. And this has caused most Christians, in my judgment and experience, to suffer what I call acute versification syndrome, AVS. And this is a
And
cognitive.
when you say verses were added,
Yes,
you
right.
don't mean words were added. You
No.
mean numbers were added.
Yeah, numbers were added to
Yeah.
the
All
sentences.
those little numbers that we
Yes,
call
right,
verses. Yeah,
right.
those weren't in the originals.
They were not in the original. No,
Huh.
they did not come until 1500 years later. But here's the problem. Those are good for locating a sentence. Like if you want to show somebody a sentence or, reference something. All right. Chapter 4, verse 9. Okay, easy to find. But the problem is that we've been conditioned to read the New Testament through fragmented sentences, that
Yeah.
is verses, and also cut and paste those verses from different books of the Bible to create doctrines and practices.
Yeah.
And we lift them out of their context. That's why I call it AVS, acute versification syndrome. This is a cognitive condition characterized by an inability to comprehend biblical texts holistically and in their context. And this is the reason why we have 40,000 plus denominations in the Protestant world, all claiming that they're standing on the word of God. It's because they're all taking these verses from different letters and different books of the Bible, pasting them together to create their own particular doctrine or theology. And so what my book does is it eradicates that. It puts you in the story. You start out in the very beginning. You follow the 12 apostles, after Jesus. I have some chapters on him and his ministry. You follow the 12 apostles in Jerusalem. You see what happens as they bring the gospel to the Jewish world. And then you have Paul of Tarsus. He becomes converted, and now he's traveling and he's raising up first century churches, and then they get into crisis and he writes letters to them, and you're actually watching it all unfold. You're getting the historical background for each book, each letter that Paul wrote, that James wrote, that Peter wrote. You know what's happening. You know what the people are like. You've seen the cities. You know what it looks like. You know how they live, and you get into his mind, Paul's mind, Peter's mind, James' mind, Jude's mind, and you understand now what they're addressing. And it's in context. And then when you finish that background, as you're reading this narrative, then you have the letter, right? You have the letter of Galatians. It's right there. You don't have to stop and go to your Bible. It's right there. And all the verses are taken out, but it's formatted well so you could still read it easily. And now you understand exactly what happened, what's being said, why it's being said. And brother, it opens up the New Testament like one cannot imagine. And it just, like I said, it revolutionized my life. And that's why I did the hard work. You said it was a lifetime pursuit. It has been. This goes back to 1998, the research.
Mm,
So, yeah, that's exactly why I wrote the book.
man. So I, did not, I don't think I ever thought about it at all. It wasn't like a discussion. It wasn't anything in my mind, how the books of the New Testament were arranged, especially the letters of Paul. Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, you're saying they were not only were they not written in that order, but that order is actually the order of their length. So
Yes.
so Galatians being the long, Ephesians, then Philippians, then Colossians, right? So and so on. So this blew me away when I read this from you, when I learned this, which because of this reason, because I knew that this had happened to the Quran. And so I've always thought it very interesting that all the surahs of the Quran they're not in any logical or chronological order. They're in order from longest to shortest. And I always found that to be a flaw with the Quran. And then to discover that the same thing is true with Paul's letters.
Yes.
This is kind of shocking. Like, why is it? Do you know why? Why were they
Yes.
put in this order? Why aren't
Yes.
they chronological in the first place?
Yes. So what happened was in the ancient world, when authors had their works compiled, people were compiling the writings of various authors. It was a tradition to put it in or the order of length. So they would take the longest one and put it first. That's why Romans is the first of Paul's letters to appear, and why Philemon is the last, because Philemon is the shortest, right?
Mm,
And so if you go through it, they're all arranged by length, and it's not a sacred it's not a sacred practice. It's not a Christian practice. It's just a traditional practice that people used in the ancient world. Paul's letters were collected and put together in the 2nd century. So that's when this started. And they did the same thing with the letters of Peter, the letters of John, 1st John, 2nd John, 3rd John. And so they just put them all in different groups according to length. And so there was nothing sinister about it. It was just a
mhm.
tradition. And the same thing with the Gospels. The Gospels are not chronological. Mark was not the first Matthew was not the first gospel written. Many scholars believe it was Mark. Okay.
Right.
And not only that, but each of those gospels, they tell the story of Jesus, and it's often not chronological because they are following certain themes and they're highlighting certain themes. And there's a criticism that skeptics will often level, and that
Mhm.
criticism is that the Gospels are not really biographies, and the reason why they say that is because you don't really have much about Jesus before he turns 30. There's just like one story about him being
Right.
12 years old. It's his birth, and then it fast
Yeah.
forwards to when he's being baptized. And here's the thing, though. In the 1st century, when you wrote a biography, this is true for all the biographies in the 1st century, they didn't focus on the childhood of the individual being written about. That was not something that interests them, right? Those were years that, were not remarkable. And so they always wrote about the exploits of the individual when they were an adult. And so what's fascinating too about the Gospels is that nowhere in the 1st century or even after was a biography written and survived about a carpenter or somebody who claimed to
Mm.
be a messianic figure. There are lots of messianic figures. There's no biographies about them. The biographies were about like politicians, right? Or kings
Yeah.
or very wealthy people who had some kind of a massive influence, not an artisan from Nazareth, you know. And so that just speaks to the fact that this person Jesus was truly remarkable. And
Yeah.
if he really was who he said he was, you would expect people to write his story down, and it would survive all this time. That's uncanny.
Yeah.
So,
That's one of the shocking facts is that there's more written about um, Jesus than there is the Roman emperor who had him killed.
yes,
That
absolutely.
that's mind-boggling. You you I want to ask you too about just like the whole idea of a chronological Bible.
Yes, yes.
So just in general here, the whole idea of it. Um, I once read a chronological Bible. I did one of those 1 year plans
Right.
of a chronological Bible that I don't recommend because it didn't put any context to anything.
Yes.
It just arranged it. And what happens when you read a chronological Bible in year is you will wind up reading the exact same story twice, sometimes 4 times. It's like, didn't I just read this yesterday? It seems like
Right.
yesterday. This seems like yesterday's read, and so it's a kind of difficult thing I thought to read it like that. So that's my baggage coming into this conversation about chronological Bibles. How is yours different? How is what you've done and how you've approached it different from like maybe the listener who's done what I did and gone through a painful chronological?
Oh man. Well, my book is completely different from a chronological Bible. Now, most of the major Christian publishing houses have put out chronological Bibles over the years. And that has changed very little in our understanding of the Bible and the New Testament. And the reason is you don't see the whole story, the grand narrative, when reading a chronological Bible, because chronological Bibles, as you said, all they do is shift the books around and they put them in a different order. You don't have the historical background behind what you're reading. You don't have all of the details filled in. You don't have the dots connected from the book of Acts to what's in the epistles. See, when Luke wrote the book of Acts, which covers Pentecost all the way to Paul's first imprisonment in Rome, it covers about 32 years. When you read that, we have to understand that Luke is abridging his narrative. He's condensing it highly. He's leaving a lot of things out because he's only interested in certain themes that he wants his readers to know. Well, here's the thing. When you read Paul's letters, when you read the letter of James, when you read other epistles in the New Testament, they give details about the same time frame that Luke leaves out.
Mm,
And so what my book does is it takes those pieces of information that Luke leaves out of his narrative, but we have them in Paul and others. I blend it together so you see the whole thing unfold. And
mm.
it is powerful, right? And so chronological Bibles don't do that.
Right.
All they do is they shift the books around. And so consequently, you can read a chronological Bible from cover to cover 20 times and still not know the story of the early church. And
Yeah.
that's why I took the Himalayan task of writing the Untold Story of the New Testament Church, revised and expanded, which not only gives you the story, but it does it in such a way that it unlocks the New Testament letters. See, I was in the fog so much, and I think many Christians are too, and pastors have told me this as well, that so much that's in Paul's letters are mysterious and hard to grasp. Same thing with Peter and James, etc. But when you put the whole story together, as I've done in this book, all of those things become clear and the fog lifts and you get to understand exactly what's going on. I mean, you may not understand virtually every single word, but virtually every word you will. And that's what this book does. And Goose, here's the thing. We are being transformed as Christians through a number of ingredients that God uses. One of them is suffering. If we react to it the proper way. The New Testament is clear about this. God
Yeah.
allows suffering in our lives to transform our character if we respond to it the right way. We can waste our sufferings.
Mhm.
Okay. I've done that before. But the other way he transforms us is through the renewal of the mind. And that mechanism, the mechanism he uses for that is God's word, God's written word, which points to the living word, Christ. Well, if we don't understand the written word of God, if we're reading it just out of duty or obligation, or if we're really hungry and thirsty to know what it means, but we have the current arrangement that our New Testaments, put those books in, and we don't have the historical background, and we don't have the chronology, and we don't have the whole narrative, we're not going to understand a great deal of what we're reading. And you cannot be transformed by it if you don't understand it.
Mhm.
So this book is actually creating, even though it's only been out for like 3 months, well, almost 3 months, it's creating massive transformation in the people who are reading it, which is so encouraging to me. And I praise the Lord for it, because this was a very heavy lift to put this book together. You know what it looks like. So anyway, but that's
Yeah,
important. It's important to know that transformation is necessary, but it requires you understand what you're reading.
I can see how without this level of understanding of context, one would be very susceptible, like we are as a culture, to just lifting out sentences, just random sentence here that I like, random sentence here that I like. They've got little numbers by them, so I'll pull this one out and I'll pull this one out, and
Hmm.
kind of like you said, copy and paste together a doctrine or a teaching that you can adhere to based on really just pulling off little sound bites instead of taking the thing in its larger
Yes.
context, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
I'm wondering, can you give us an example of anything that comes to your mind that is commonly misunderstood by a lot of Christians because of not having the broader
Mm, mm,
context?
mm. Well, do you have 4 hours? I
Yes,
mean,
let's
it
do
would
it.
take a long, long
I'm
time.
putting on a pot of coffee.
There's so many of them, brother. But I'll just give you a few
Yeah.
that are commonly, misunderstood. And there's so much. But there's a passage in Hebrews chapter 10, which we often hear, pastors and preachers give to people, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together. So that's interpreted to mean you have to be at church Sunday
That
morning.
that's why you have to
And
go to church.
yeah,
Don't
you have to go
forsake the
to,
gathering of
yeah,
the
don't forsake,
assembling of the
right.
saints.
Right. And the way it's interpreted is you're going to enter into a building, sit down like a passive individual, listen to a sermon, sing some songs with the worship team, throw money in the offering plate, and then you go home. Well, that is not at all what the writer of Hebrews is talking about.
Hmm.
Because if you look at the whole passage and then you look at the whole story, again, we have to get the story. What was going on in the first century? You find a couple of things that stand out. One, when the early Christians assembled, they were assembling in very small gatherings like homes, and they were all participating. It was not sitting down passively listening to someone preach. They were assembling together, and they all were exhorting one another and encouraging one another and ministering to one another. Because in that very same passage, he says, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, but exhorting one another. It's
Well, hey,
right there in the passage.
this sounds more like a Men's Alliance tribe gathering around a fire where everybody's participating.
That is actually closer to the
Yeah.
way the first century Christians met
Nobody's a
than what
nobody's a
happens on
passive
Sunday morning
audience
church.
member.
Yeah, that's very much the truth. It's a lot closer. And so the early Christians, when they gathered together for church, ecclesia, it was an open participatory meeting where they exhorted one another. Now, they did have ministry meetings. The 12 apostles preached in Solomon's portico, and they shared, and Paul would come into Ephesus and he preached and taught at the lecture hall in Tyrannus's hall. But even those situations, the Greek words make it clear it was dialogical. So they weren't just, preaching and everyone was listening and not saying a word. They had conversations. But that's another story. But that's an example. Here's another
Yeah.
one that's really big. You have a doctrine which separates disciples and converts. And it usually goes like this. Jesus didn't want us to make converts. He wanted us to make disciples. And what the Lord is after is disciples, not converts. When you look at the whole story, you cannot separate a convert from a disciple.
Mm.
All converts were disciples. They were all followers. If you were not a disciple, if you were not a follower, guess what? You were not a convert. These were synonyms, okay?
Mm.
And this becomes very clear when you look at the whole narrative. The disciple convert separation came in the 19th century. That's
Really?
how new it is, yeah. So another one, Goose, is Paul's thorn in the flesh.
Oh,
And I
I
have
love I
all
love this one. I can't wait to hear what you're going to say.
well, I have a whole thing on it, and sometimes in the book I'll have these excursus, these little boxes that kind of
Yeah.
give more detail. But if you look at the whole story chronologically, it becomes very evident that Paul's thorn was a human being motivated by Satan. It wasn't an eye disease, it wasn't temptation. He had enemies in the church in Jerusalem, and they were part of what Paul calls the circumcision party. And these were people that were zealous for the law of Moses. They wanted to get all the Gentile Christians circumcised, okay? And they wanted to put everybody under the
That's
Mosaic
a tough
law.
sales pitch right there.
It is. But they used, God's going to be happy. And if you really want to be part of God's covenant people, you have to do this. And so what happened is there was a leader in that group of the circumcision party. And that leader, that man, followed Paul wherever he went to plant a church. He would go with his little group, the circumcision party, and they would rip Paul to shreds. Paul wasn't there, he was away. They did it in Galatia. That's what Galatians is about. He's responding to them, okay? They did it in Thessalonica. They did it in Corinth. And finally, we get an insight into what was going on because Paul talks about it in 2 Corinthians. And he says, God gave me a thorn in the flesh. And I asked him to take it away. And the Lord said, I'm not going to deliver you from the thorn. I'm going to deliver you through the thorn. And that's exactly what the Lord does in our lives. Sometimes he takes a point of suffering away, or a particular affliction away, or a problem away. He delivers us from it, but often he delivers us through it, where he doesn't take it away, but we rise above it. And so there's a whole thing there, but that is one that's commonly misunderstood. And every scholar I showed this theory to, when I made my case, and the case is in the book, they have told me I can't refute that. It makes sense. So that was encouraging. Another one, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. That's 1 Peter
Yeah.
3:15. Well, this is usually used as an apologetic, like, okay, if you really want to
Absolutely.
get out,
Yeah.
you need to go
That's
ahead and
how
give.
I use it. So I'm ready to get corrected. Bring
Okay.
it on.
Well, here's the thing. Peter is basically saying that the initiation of that conversation comes to the person who asks you questions. See, like, okay, Goose, hey man, you
Yeah.
live differently. How
Right.
come you don't
Like,
cuss?
just in case you get asked, be
Well, that's what
ready to
he's
give a
saying.
response.
He's
Yeah.
saying, you're going to live such a life that's distinct, and it's going to provoke questions. Okay, why don't you do this? Why don't you run around with these people? Why is it that you have this built into your life? And so he's saying be ready, but then he says do so with gentleness and respect. Now that's often missed by apologetic people, because when the gospel is shared often by Christian people who are zealous for evangelism, they're not doing it in gentleness or respect.
Right. You're absolutely right. And that part is extremely important, and we could never leave that out.
Right,
Yeah.
right. It's more combative, and so anyway, that's another example. Another example would be preaching the kingdom versus preaching grace. And so we have, again, teachers who say, well, Jesus preached the kingdom, Paul preached grace. That is vaporized when you read the whole story, because what you discover is that the gospel is called the gospel of the kingdom, the gospel of grace, the gospel of the grace of God, the eternal gospel, the gospel of Christ. It's all names for the same message. And Jesus preached the kingdom, but he also preached grace, and Paul preached grace, but he also preached the kingdom. You find this all throughout the book of Acts from beginning to end. When Paul's converted, all the way to when he's in Rome, he's preaching the kingdom. And so that's an important thing too. And we had that distinction once again in the 19th century. I can give so many more, Goose. You know, I have become all things to all people. The issue of women speaking in church meetings is a big one.
All right. Tell us about that one. Hey, men. Thrivent is proud to support Men's Alliance's goals, and financial advisor Dr. Andrew Newman, call sign Sage, is excited to help tribe members and those they care about make financial choices guided by their Christian values. Faith is what fuels Andrew. Does it fuel you too? Call Andrew today at 612-246-0725 so you can take care of yourself and those you care about, including your local tribe and Men's Alliance.
Okay. All right.
I hear this one, and it always requires the pastor to give an explanation of historical context in order to interpret it, but that historical context is not found there in the passage. And so I'm curious to hear your unpacking of this.
Yeah, well, first let me back up and just say this. Often when you hear this preached, what you're hearing is a discussion on whether or not women can be pastors.
Mm-hmm.
And that's interesting because you cannot find any evidence in the New Testament for what we today call a pastor, male or female. Okay? In other words, a person who's viewed as the head of the church, an individual, a human being, a person who preaches sermons every Sunday morning, right? A person who marries the young, buries the dead. You can't find that person anywhere in the New Testament.
Full-time professional clergy, right?
Yeah, CEO pastor,
Yeah.
but I mean, what we know is the pastor. Now, there were shepherds, but they were always plural. And they were also called elders and overseers. All right. Now, so when people say, well, do you believe in female pastors? I back up and say, well, show me a pastor who's male or female in the New Testament.
I don't believe in pastors.
Right. But this passage here is talking about, can women speak in a church meeting? Right? Yeah. You had men and women in church meetings. All right. So you got two passages. One of them is in 1 Timothy 2. I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. She must be quiet. Now, if you understand what was happening in Ephesus at the time, it becomes clear what Paul was talking about. And I get into it in the book. But there were some women who were dominating and domineering in the meetings, and they were actually pushing false doctrine. And this becomes clear when you read the whole letter in context, right? So this was not some kind of a universal mandate that Paul was making. And it becomes even more clear when you look at the statement in 1 Corinthians 14, right, about Corinth, where he talks about, women being quiet in the church meetings. Well, here's the thing. If you read 1 Corinthians 11, just 3 chapters before that, he acknowledges women praying and prophesying in the meetings. So he's not contradicting himself. He's talking about a certain kind of conversation, a certain kind of questioning. And the Greek words make this clear too. They were kind of chatting while the meetings were going on and they were being disruptive. And so that's what he was talking about in that particular context. So you have a lot of this that it's important to understand context. It's important to understand the historical background. And here's another one I'll give you. 1 Corinthians 7, it's not good for a man to touch a woman. All right, well,
Oh, I don't
that,
like that verse.
well, Paul didn't care for it either. That was a slogan that the Corinthians were spreading. And Paul gives the slogan and then he responds to it. The same thing and he's all for marriage and he's all for, wives having husbands and husbands having wives. And also, he's saying that if you're married, you're joined, you're one. Her
Yeah,
body is your body
yeah.
is her body. I mean, this is what he says in that very passage, but that was a slogan that was being promoted. Another slogan
Interesting.
in 1 Corinthians 6:12, I have the right to do anything. All right. But not everything is beneficial. And so that again was a slogan. The Corinthians were libertinists. They were basically saying we're under grace so we can do anything. And so they had this slogan, I have the right to do anything. I'm under grace. And then Paul responds and says, not everything is beneficial. So he's refuting the slogan. So he does this in 1 Corinthians quite often. Another example would be 1 Thessalonians 4:11. Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. You should mind your own business and work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders and so that you may not be dependent on anybody. Okay, there are people who read this passage and said, well, the Lord doesn't want me to get involved in anything in the world. He doesn't want me to speak out against anything. He just wants me to mind my own business
Yeah,
and
yeah,
work with
that's
my
what it
hands.
sounds like. I can see how they would do that.
Right, right. But what Paul's dealing with, and again, the book makes this clear. My book goes into the history and also the letters. We have a lot in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians that give us insight into what was going on in Thessalonica in that church. They were under intense persecution. They were being socially harassed by their Jewish neighbors and their Gentile neighbors, the pagan neighbors. All right. They were under
Mm.
fire. And when you're under fire, you keep your head down. You mind your own business. You don't try to make things worse. And so that's what Paul was dealing with. It's a contextual thing. So yeah, those are just some examples, bro. I mean, there's so
Those
many
are some
others.
those are some great ones. I'll tell you the women being silent in the church one. This is something that first of all I consider it a non-essential, so I'm
Right.
perfectly comfortable disagreeing with people on.
Right.
But like it's one that my jury has been out on for a while, and I've talked to a number of pastors asking them their opinion. I'm like, how do y'all interpret this? What do you see here? And I've kind of been just on the fence for a few years. I'm like, it seems to be pretty clear. But then every pastor I talk to says, well, you have to understand the context. There were women who were being disruptive and stuff like that. And I'm like, okay, uh, I guess you've got to have this extra knowledge in order to be able to interpret it. So what I'm saying is like there's so many of these, that being a big one, I think, that we need all this extra context on. And
Absolutely.
and they're problematic. They're always discussed between Christians. Christians agree, disagree all over them. So this is great. There's a tremendous need here for knowing this context. And like you said about one of the verses you mentioned a second ago, understanding like the Greek word that is used there, and specifically like that means like not just talking, but kind of like disruptive badgering,
Yeah,
right? It's a,
yeah. There's two. The one in
yeah.
Timothy is more of domination, like
Mhm.
usurp authority over women. It's about domineering. And then the other one in First Corinthians is really a chatting kind of conversation. You know, it's not standing up and speaking or just sharing or prophesying, because Paul does say they prophesied in the meetings. I mean, he's talking to
Right.
the women and the men. You know, and here's another thing. It's so interesting. I don't understand why this is an issue, because neither of those passages are talking about the modern role of the single pastor over a church. That they're not. That's not even in view. That wasn't even in the New Testament. You
Yeah,
can't
that's a
find that,
great
right?
point.
That's one. The second thing is, why is this even applicable? Because I can take any Sunday morning service in any Protestant denomination, and I'll add Anglican and Catholic and Episcopalian, where during that service are either men or women talking at all, except whoever's on the platform, you know, giving a sermon or the announcements. Where is it? I mean, there's not like women talking in the meetings. There's not men talking in the meeting. I'm talking about in the pews out there in the congregation. It
Right.
doesn't even happen. So that whole conversation that Paul's dealing with, and look at the whole passage, 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14, all right? He's talking about a gathering, a church meeting. You can call it worship if you want, all right? Where everyone is participating, and he's giving correction, and he's saying, you know, if someone prophesies, let it be at the most 2 or 3, and then let the others interpret. And someone can, you know, if they're speaking in tongues, for example, and let everyone else judge. I mean, that doesn't even happen in the normal Sunday morning service. So much of that doesn't even apply. So why is this question even practical? You see what I'm trying to
Yeah,
say?
I see what you're saying. It's a different model and structure altogether. Hey, I want to change the subject. I've got
Yes.
one I'm dying to ask you about.
Yes.
Um, I grew up thinking, I grew up in church and Sunday school, and I grew up thinking that when Saul met God on the Damascus Road, that God changed his name to Paul.
Okay.
And and I hear this all the time, that when he changed his name to Paul, or when his name was changed to Paul, I don't find that anywhere in the book of Acts that his name was ever changed. It seems like his name was always Saul and Paul. And even after his conversion on the Damascus Road, he is still referred to for several chapters as Saul. And then it just subtly introduces it as saying, also known as Paul. Where do we get this notion that God gave him a name change?
Mhm.
And am I wrong? Did this happen? Tell me the context on this.
Well, that's fascinating. And for the person who said that the Lord changed his name, I would have to quote Wayne Campbell and say, "Excuse me? A baking powder?" Yeah. So basically, there's no evidence at all that his name was changed. What happens is that in the Roman world, if you're a Roman citizen, and Paul was, you had 3 different names.
Yeah.
And I go into this in the book. So his Jewish name was Saul. And of course, he was named after King Saul. His Roman name, one of his Roman names, was Paul. All right. That happened way before he was a convert.
Right.
Now, what Luke does is he gives his Jewish name, Saul, in the very beginning. And this is the context that he's writing about. Paul's in the Jewish world, you know, he's going to Damascus. He's in Palestine. He is ministering to his own people, the Jewish people. But when Paul and Barnabas begin their first apostolic journey, they're leaving that world and now they're heading into the Gentile world. And so Paul then, or excuse me, Luke then begins to call him Paul, because
Yeah.
what he is known as in the Roman Gentile world. And not only that, but Luke shifts the order. First it's Barnabas and Saul, and then it's Paul and Barnabas.
Hmm.
Because what happened is, in the very beginning, and I make a case for this in the book, Barnabas was Saul's mentor, right? He
That's
was the
right.
one who, kind of trained him, just like the 12 trained Barnabas. And so what happened, though, is that as they continued on their journey and as they continued in the Lord's work, there was a shift of priority. And Paul became the leading figure in that team. Paul, Barnabas, and then Mark for a time went with them. So, yeah, that's all it is. There's no evidence that his name was
But
changed. He had that name way back when he was
somehow
young.
this has crept into churches, and everybody thinks it, and everybody repeats it, and it's I don't know where it came from. I don't know how this got started, but it's propagated everywhere. And anyway, I just encourage listeners, go read it for yourself. Go read Acts. He never got his name changed. His name was never
Right,
changed, right?
right.
It's like, and you see the same thing with the other people in the New Testament as well, right? Like Peter or
Hmm.
Cephas, right? He's referred
Yeah,
to as a
yeah.
lot of things.
Yep.
He's Simon, he's Cephas, you know.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of them had different names. And again, it goes back to the fact that, in the Roman world, at least if you're a Roman citizen, you had three different names. And I get into this in the book. And then Jesus also had a knack for giving nicknames to his followers. All right.
Which I
So
love.
that's kind of cool. So, he calls Peter a stone. He
Yeah. He
calls,
gives call signs.
yeah, yeah. He calls James and John the sons of thunder.
Yeah.
And it's kind of cool because I give nicknames to my close friends. And look, I'm talking to a guy who's called Goose, okay?
That's
I'm
right.
sure that's
That's
not
right.
your
That's why
birth
I love it.
name, right? So, but that's in line with what the Lord had done
Yeah.
with his own. He had these nicknames for different people and who he was close to.
God loves to change names, right? Jacob, Israel,
That's right.
Abraham, there's call signs throughout the Bible.
Yep,
I'm
yep,
gonna stick with that.
yep,
Hey,
yep.
let me ask you your just opinion. What's one of your favorites? What's one of your favorite kind of light bulb moment realizations about a common misunderstanding um, in the New Testament, with the context clarifying and making it clear to us? What's one of your favorites that you feel is of extreme importance?
Well, I think, you know, what we talked about, Paul's thorn in the flesh, was a
Yeah.
major revelation to me. And not only because it illuminated the story, here's a guy who's the ringleader of this group of people who are just arch enemies of Paul of Tarsus, to the point where they were so obsessed they followed him everywhere he went and tried to undo his work.
I cannot
And
imagine how discouraging that must have been.
oh my goodness,
Like,
that's
do you
right.
guys not have anything better to do?
Exactly, exactly. But here's the thing, if you're in ministry today, very often you will have a thorn in the flesh of
Yeah.
that kind of type of person, especially if you're making a big impact. You're going to have
Yep.
someone who is going to be so obsessed they can't see straight. This doesn't happen with everyone, but it is something that repeats itself. And I love how Paul handles it because A, he never mentions the guy by name. The closest he comes is he mentions, the Paul, he calls him a thorn in the flesh. But in Second Corinthians, the later chapters, he just rips that whole group to shreds. And in Galatians, when he first mentions him, it's clear because he talks about a he who is troubling you, he who is agitating you. You know, he was this man, this thorn in the flesh, had gone to the Galatian churches, pulled out the knife, and said, Paul didn't tell you the whole gospel. And let
Mm.
me tell you how bad Paul is. He is so bad that he had the audacity and the gall to rebuke Peter to his face.
Yeah.
Peter, the Lord's
Yeah.
one of the Lord's 12, one of the
The
main
rock.
guys. Yeah. So it's a study in psychological warfare of how these guys came into Paul's territory, the converts that Paul made, and tried to uh, defame him and degrade him and take away their confidence in him, to the point of persuading them to follow the law of Moses, even circumcision. And that's why Paul, when he writes Galatians, he's angry. He's
Yeah.
upset. You know, usually when he writes a letter, he has these beautiful greetings to the church. He doesn't even have a greeting like that in Galatians. He just goes to work. He dips
Skip
his
the
pen in
greeting.
acid and he's just going after them. And he even makes this comment too, which I think is awesome. He says, I wish, I'm paraphrasing now, but it's
Yeah.
at the end of the letter. He says, I wish that this group, when they pull out the knife, they'll slip and actually mutilate themselves
Go the whole length, right?
to themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just interesting. There's irony there. There's just a lot, but it's a beautiful treatise on liberty in Christ, from legalism, right? Legalistic thinking and legalistic practice. And so it stands the test of time. It's still here, as well as all of his other letters. But this book really is a key that unlocks the New Testament epistles. And again, I get back to, God wants to transform us. He wants to change us from the inside out. And if we don't understand what we're reading in the scripture, our minds can't be renewed, and we're not going to be transformed. Our transformation is going to be hindered greatly.
Yeah.
So that's why I wrote this book, man. And by the way, I know you have a lot of guys listening to you. My work is the books, I have two podcasts, by the way, Christ is All and the Insurgents podcast. My work is for Christians of all ages. I've got older people listening, I've got high school students listening. But the main audience that resonates mostly with my work are men
Yeah.
between the ages of 21 and 45, just
Mhm.
FYI. So for whatever reason, my message really speaks to that group strongest.
Well, I think, some of that has got to do with the fact that it's very direct and straightforward, right? Your writing is very direct, very straightforward, and I think that appeals to a lot of men. I'm thrilled to hear, that your book is on the high school reading level. That's what Men's Alliance, that's my reading level, and that's what we all need. Is we need to be reading. We need to understand the Word of God. Like
That's
you
right.
said, that's how our minds are renewed. Also, that's how you stay sharp and don't get led astray by
Yeah,
false preaching, right?
that's
If
right.
you don't know how to discern what it says, you will be susceptible, man, to hearing anything that sounds good, that sounds appealing,
That's
right?
right.
That
That's
sounds
right.
like what you want to hear. When in fact, a lot of the teachings are not what I want to hear. They're not what I want to hear,
Hmm.
right? And so the New Testament is constantly telling me to not live the way that I
Hmm.
want to live.
Hmm.
I'm called to a higher standard, and if I'm listening to preaching that tells me that it's okay to do what I feel
Hmm.
like doing,
Hmm.
boy, that's an appealing, magnetic pull towards that. But if I don't know the Bible, then I'm not going to be able to say, "Hey, that's false. That's
That's
incorrect."
right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's interesting because the false teaching and the errors that were prevalent in the first century that Paul combated, he wrote most of the New Testament letters, so I mentioned him. They're still with us today. He had two enemies. They were the main enemies of the gospel. One of them was legalism, and that was the idea that in order to make God happy, in order to be saved, but also sanctified, you had to follow all of these laws, and you had to do it in your own power and in your own strength, right?
Yeah.
So, so what it ended up doing was creating people that were, on the one hand, just living under a shadow of guilt because they're not doing enough to make God happy. And they wake up every morning with a condemnation hangover because God's mad at them. Or, on the other hand, it produces this harsh, self righteous judgmentalism That's what legalism does. Legalists are judging they're finding fault with everybody
Yeah.
else, but they don't realize that they're walking in hypocrisy, because the sins they condemn others for, they're committing equal offensive sins. They're just different, right? So I'm going
Yeah.
to condemn you for these sins. They're worse than mine, not realizing that in God's eyes, he levels the playing field. So there's the gospel of legalism, and that's still preached today. I mean, it doesn't come out that way. Preacher's not going to say, I'm going to present legalism to you today, this morning. But if God's people are living under a hail of condemnation, and they're not doing enough, and they're not good enough, and they got to do better than the best they can do, that's a sign of a legalistic gospel. The other gospel, false gospel, that Paul dealt with in the first century, and again, my book brings this out clearly, and it's articulated a lot better, but it's the opposite. It's the gospel of libertinism. And I think you were mentioning that in your conversation, where it appeals to the flesh. And it basically is this teaching that says, we're under grace. God is love. It doesn't matter how you live.
Yeah.
As long as you believe, you're fine. God understands. And so we have,
Universalism, love wins.
yeah, all of that. And
Yeah.
it could even be more subtle in
Yeah.
evangelical churches, where yeah, we believe in Jesus and we follow him, and they'll emphasize certain things in the ministry of Jesus. Usually it's helping the poor, which is
Yeah.
wonderful, and the New
Some
Testament
social
teaches
justice.
that. But then all this other stuff, the moral will of God, well, that's sort of kind of played down and ignored, and it's not that important. And so you have people living just like the world, and they're comfortable in that because they're giving a teaching that justifies it, right? And so the conscience stops operating at high levels. See, that's what false doctrine does. False doctrine blunts the voice of the conscience. That's why it's so dangerous. And so the gospel, the true gospel, is the gospel of the kingdom, which is radical to the core, man. All out surrender, full abandonment to Jesus Christ as this world's true Lord. But on the other hand, it's also the gospel of grace, and that we can't do this ourselves. It is beyond the human capacity. That's why God gives us his life by the Spirit, and it is by living by the Spirit that we can overcome the power of the flesh. We can't do it in ourselves. And so this two-pronged, high-octane gospel of the kingdom and the gospel of grace is what I have written most of my books and most of my messages, my conference messages on the podcasts and so forth, are really trying to present that gospel to people, because I think it's been lost. The gospel of the kingdom has been diluted, or it's been turned into this legalistic, effort-driven call for people to do what's beyond them, their human capacities. And that's what Pharisaism is. It's
Yeah.
the self-righteous. We're doing it ourselves. We're better than you guys. Look what you're doing. Look what we're doing. And Jesus had the most trouble with the religious leaders. It wasn't the sinners; it
How
was the
about that?
religious leaders. Yeah, it was. Those are the people who were, straight laced, etc. They were doing everything right, but then they added
Greatest
all of this.
irony of all time, maybe,
Yeah,
is the
absolutely,
fact that
absolutely.
religious leaders did not like Jesus.
Right, right. He did not fit into their box. He was so different. And he gave the Sadducees apoplexy, and they're kind of the equivalents to modern day, Christians on the left, who are progressive. But he also gave the Pharisees, fits of rage, because they were the more, moralistic, religious, the equivalent of, conservative Christians on the right that are just so hard-nosed and narrow, and there's no grace or love or tolerance for anybody else. So both the Pharisee and the Sadducee had major problems with Jesus because he did not fit into their religious boxes. He broke out of them at every turn, and so yeah, there's a lot to this, man. And
Yeah.
I just think if people read this book. Again, it's an easy read. One person likened it unto the chosen on paper,
Mm,
although it's not just the ministry of Jesus, it's the whole New Testament
yeah.
story. I think it'll really open up the New Testament letters, the New Testament itself. And it's a thrilling story, man. It's a sensational adventure just to go through the thing and see, what actually happened in that first century
Man,
and what we have in Holy Writ. So, yeah.
this is great. Frank, tell us again your website. Where can people go to hear more about you?
Yeah, so if they go to Frank Viola, all one word, .org, they'll get access to everything. All 20 books are on that site. The 2 podcasts I have, the new book, The Untold Story, the New Testament Church, people can sample it. We have like a 44-page sampler. They can listen to interviews like this one. We put those up on there. We also have a new video podcast, a 10 series. Each video is 10 minutes. It's visual. So there's
Man,
just a
all
lot
kinds of
there.
great stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, they can get everything on that page, frankviola.org.
Yeah. FrankViola.org. Guys, we'll put that in the show notes. Seriously, Men's Alliance tribesmen need to be readers. You need to be reading. You need to be sharpening yourself, and we need to know the Word of God. So
That's right.
I'm encouraging everybody pick up a copy, the Untold Story of the New Testament Church, and let's sharpen each other. Let's sharpen ourselves through this renewing of our minds. Frank, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for being on our podcast, brother.
Thank you, brother, and God bless you and the work you're doing. I appreciate it.
Thank you. To find out more about what we're doing and to join us on our mission, go to men'salliancetribe.com. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and give us a 5-star review.